Hey everybody, how are you guys doing? This is a continuation of what was the second talk on Hegel, and now we are going to get to, as mentioned in this third talk on Hegel, please see the other two, as well as my talks on philosophy, that we are going to talk about, and hopefully this will be a shorter video. I will try to stick just to the notes here in order to get through this and not give you too much material. But in order to get through the material, we need to talk about Hegel's master-slave dialectic, which is one of his most influential ideas in the history of human thought, of Hegel's anyway, and is a decently influential idea in German thought and the world. Used by Marx, feminists, anti-racists, and others a lot, and many folks, right and left. And then we are going to talk a little bit about the overall structure of Hegel's logic and just a couple of points of Hegel's logic that fill in details of what I've already been ranting about for far too long here. But you could obviously, of course, keep going. If you read out Hegel, it would take months. So one influential idea, one of his central ones, possibly the most influential, is the master-slave dialectic, which is one of the first major moments of back-and-forth thinking of Hegel and the motions of human culture. And it's very fascinating because it's also Hegel and the rise of social theory, a la Marcuse. Anthropology and psychology are just getting going in their infancy, and Hegel is talking about what it would be like to be cave people, effectively, and not yet have Egypt, as we just talked about, and go out and try to discover what relationships and society is as knocking around atomic people, better living through chemistry, and they are not, which is Egypt, yes, Egypt, Kemer, and Egyptology. And so before chemistry and better living, how did civilization happen? And Hegel is explaining how cave people came up with civilization, like the Geico commercial kind of stuff, by creating tensions of self and other and Fichtean proto-psychology. Remember, with Fichte, we have the assertion of the self and the ego, and so if I want cake and there are others that want cake, this can seem very stupid to the child and make the child cry because I want cake. Why do others want cake? That's scary. Or, of course, children decide to go back and forth lovingly, oh, we all get cake or only I get cake, and we're trying to negotiate those parts. So the self, Fichte's Ich, wants to, in a certain sense, Hegel says, in the very beginning of any interrelation, as soon as you come upon the other, and the other, capital O, is a very big thing for Sartre and French philosophy that's quite Hegelian here. If you come up against an other and you've never encountered this kind of people or this other idea or this form opposite you, other people who want their slice of cake, what gives? What fools? I get cake. That's completely contrary to my simple, stupid interests, isn't it? The psychology of this, and the easy, simple psychology, is that at first, in the first stage, I want to just eliminate, I'm just going to club the other. Unfortunately, this does suggest almost like painting the Native American as the simple savage, not so noble, who would just tomahawk, of course, which is not Native American culture, but is violence and sex and human culture all over the place, quite tribal, is at first, if you encounter another and these folks are not your kind, well, as is famous in America, American relations, thus, is that, well, Custer and Bighorn and others get the axe immediately, and there's no understanding or negotiations. How do you think I feel? Bewildered, betrayed, a la Birdcage. So there's just bam, and the gunpowder and the progress and the nothing with the brute stage of culture where you just eliminate anything that is opposed to you. Human beings, at their worst, I have watched The Black Coat's Daughter recently. Human beings at their worst just eliminate, just destroy and just like kind of categorical not. Of course, there's the opposite evil of opening the gates entirely and letting in the enemy, of course, but some simple elimination, just total genocide, which wasn't a word until after World War II, just eliminate the others. However, what happens in this stage is, and of course Hegel believes there's lots of people who never get past this stage in life because he is, a man of his times, as we keep saying. So What is civilization beyond choppy time that just is the tomahawk for Hegel and not myself? Because again, I think actually with modern anthropology post-60s, human beings remain quite all too human, as Nietzsche says in The Jungle with Darwin. Well, if you're going to get out of this, you're going to need to negotiate and you're going to need to go back and forth. Now, what's the stupid square two step of after I just kill you? What's the next second least stupid but second stupid, so slightly less stupid, but square two of human negotiations and relationships? Well, the self decides to show a bit of restraint. What Hegel describes, and this is very proto-Freud, is that you stand over the other, and you have the tomahawk, you have the club, and you're ready to kill them, and you're like, kill, death, murder, death, kill, for Wesley Snipes and the Demolition Man, I believe. You know, murder, death, kill. We're so civilized, we don't know what that is. I'm freaking out. The police department starts freaking out. They're like, there's been a murder, death, kill. And the police are like, a murder, death, kill? I don't know what that is. That's scary. Like the word kill is an offensive F word to them, you know, because they just don't have murder so much anymore. And it's like, oh my God. So you're raising the tomahawk, it's like death to the other side, and it's like, don't kill me, man, I'll work for you. You know, it's like, hey, wait a minute, slavery. Now that's a good idea. Slavery is civilization for Egypt. Let my people go, you know. And it's like, wait a minute. I got, as I have seen in Egypt, I am so cultured, is that actually there's temples like Abu Simbel, like where there's like to the north, you see northern looking people, folks would say whiter folk, kind of tied up with their elbows behind their Middle Eastern kind of Lebanese looking folks from the ancient world. Is like all tied up with their elbows behind their back. And then Southern African looking people, very much black folk, and their souls of as such, are very much tied up. And some of the Egyptians are like, we've covered the northern lighter people, the southern darker people. Hey man, we are civilization itself. We are ruling. You know, ye old civilization and its roots, according to Hegel, of course. And much love and speaking rather unrestrained, of course, but in these loving and terrible ways. So we're going to switch to total genocide to slavery. Hello, great. Now, actually, I have to say, modern research on violence definitely suggests while we are kind of murder, death, kill, and stuff, kind of murdery apes, etc., pile of seething weasels, folks, it actually isn't very human or even the animal kingdom to total go elimination mode. Total genocide is actually in total kill the other side rather than retreat or scare the other side off with horns or shouts or cries is actually rarer. Human beings and animals don't actually want to spend all the time doing all the genocide entirely. The reason is actually probably because it would be a lot more effort, and actually that's not entirely the way we're directed, just kill off all other tribes. We actually go back and forth with tribes, so it's not the total tomahawk. It's not that tribes aren't having friends and mates and others across tribal groups. That's what we actually do see, more or less, depending on the recent history of these tribes, right? Etc. That's what anthropologists say, and go talk to them about it. And the tribes. You know, again, watch Amazonians on YouTube now. It's amazing. And showing you what of that you can, of course. But that essentially, rather than just have free, out fight in the jungle, well, we're going to establish the roots of civilization and have slavery here, which is why, again, slave, master slave in the language is like, let's just be brute about it. What Hegel is saying is slavery is the roots of culture. Here, actually, again, Aristotle, Hegel knows his Aristotle. He's trying to be super Plato, super Aristotle on purpose. Aristotle's like, the roots of human civilization are slavery and subjecting women to stuff, which is why Germans are savages, because Germanic people, like myself, and Aristotle doesn't think he is, and he's called a barbarian by his Athenian fellow Greeks. And he's like, you know what? Like, yeah, depending on what you call Macedon or not, is that he's saying, you know what, like the Germans, they don't enslave their women or take slaves in battle, so they're not civilized, is what Aristotle says. And so slavery is objectivity, law, and civilization. Locking anyone up is the sign of having the master class and civilization for Hegel. And here I just lovingly say, well, yeesh, I'm not going to prove that either way. So funny enough, we go from genocide to step 2, stupid, slightly smarter, which is now we're going to hold the tomahawk over the head of the slave, and then the slave will slave away, and the master gets to sit in the sun and kick back. The slave makes the lemonade, the master sips the lemonade. Aristotle says philosophers should not work for a living because that just screws up your day. So higher class, higher caste, you get that out, and that is nice where the science and the philosophy comes from. Hegel certainly thinks that was Egypt and certainly thinks Athens was based on slavery. It'd be hard not to understand that reading the text, even in the German. So the slave does everything for the master. Now, what's going to happen here that's going to create the countercultural tension? And notice this kind of thinking and this idea has been very popular amongst folks who like fighting sexism and racism and forms of society that people don't like so much. And I don't so much. So, and I'm lefty and stuff. So confess, the slave does everything to the point that if women work, like I think feminists are fond of saying, it's like 10.2 hours a day on average, and domestic and work, and men, more slacking it on the domestic often. Now with 2-income households necessary are doing about 8-point-something hours of work on average, women 10.2 or something, and that's a common point that's brought up in pro and anti-feminist stuff, and then is debated along with differences in wages, etc. And staying out of all of that, but that is going to lead to thinking back and forth and all of these issues and our frames of the people who are pros and know this stuff, most certainly. If you're into feminist thought, you probably need to know some German and French basic concepts, because I'll walk you through the history of these things. And then I'm not the latest greatest on feminist theory and its various branches at all, but I do know the roots of this stuff and know the feminists are into it, who are the super, academic types. Specifically, is that, you can name names, and what have you, is that the slave has to do everything, like the woman has to more so slave away, say, for the man, the feminists would say. And unfortunately, what happens is the master or the master class or the men folks, the men's, they get lazy and they just ask your mother, I'm going to sit here and watch the game. And the master class gets all lazy and stagnant. And of course, and here we have to say, in mocking super white people, it's sort of like, of course, as Descartes says, you inbreed people. I'm not going to mention a French king by name, and they may be nuts enough to think that they're a wolf person or made of glass. Don't touch me. If you're like, keep your whites their whitest here. So, as with all of that, of course, and the genetic diversity being somewhat necessary for life and interaction and recycling programs, etc., as opposed to the most rigid of royalty and the Eurasian nose bridge to the Americas, that eventually the situation becomes unsustainable. It all falls off, especially if the king of glass thinks he's made of glass and shatters. And so the slaves revolt, and then you have revolution. Now that's what Hegel thinks Jesus and the Israelites were to the Egyptians. He thinks that's the Greeks to the Egyptians. Hegel here is actually saying something that isn't brought up by so many white people. The Greeks were slaves and mercenaries for and servants of the Persians and the Egyptians. Hegel is saying that most specifically. That's something we're in praising Greece and forgetting the rest of Goldern and history, white folk, is that you have a richer, complex picture going on here, even though it's an extremely Eurocentric and simplified picture here. Is all progress, hooray for Europe. Hegel is pointing out, but the Germans were slaves as that Aristotle I just told you. The Germans were the slaves of the Greeks. They would have, like the Egyptians, had darker and lighter skinned slaves, darker and lighter skinned than themselves. And guess who takes over as the master slaves of the Greeks? The Germans. That's right. So in other words, for a lot of folks, if you take somebody who's like nowadays conservative, well, white people built the modern world. It's like, you're not even getting here that Hegel says that, but the Greeks, think 300, revolted against the old state and were this new revolutionary thing, most, celebrating the 300 in ways I don't entirely, and that's Sparta, and most people celebrate Athens and Yeesh either way. But then guess who gets to be the slave, uncivilized people who rises up and eventually becomes Lutheranism? That's right, again, the final answer for human culture. Well, folks, that would be ye old Germanics, yes, who now have risen up past the Greeks and the Romans to be their former slaves, and now the masters of the universe and the cosmos and the world globally. And that's Hegel describing history up to the 1800s. And you can see why he would say all of that. So in other words, again, like with all this stuff, it is amazing what he does and does not say, and that is and isn't what people still say in better and worse ways, so weirdly and wonderfully, again, with all of this. So, hey, educate yourself, kids. This is Hegel's explanation of why the Egyptians and Babylonians and ye old Orientals failed to discover philosophy enough and art and subjectivity and playwright plays a Plato enough with the plot twist of the symposium, I'm sure. And the Greeks actually failed to discover the unity of subjectivity and objectivity together as the modern sciences and modern philosophy. And think here the latter stages of what we've been covering in this class, and Hegel going through the motions, specifically showing how Hume leads to Kant, Descartes, more dogmatic, leads to Hume, which is skeptical, leads to Kant, trying to get in the middle, swings too much, leads to Hegel. That's what he thinks. Descartes, rationalist dogmatism. Hume, skeptical to all truth is prejudice. Kant tries to fix it as static categories. Hegel is now going to say the motions are the stillness, man of the chess pieces of history, life, individual, social, and thus all is, as the Zen say, mind. That is very much what Hegel is saying, and the master-slave dialectic is actually a model for everything that will follow. In other words, just as the small triangle is a base of a larger triangle, this master-slave idea is the frame of the phenomenology of spirit as I described it in each stage. It is the first and starting stage of cave people becoming civilized. It then is the Egyptians turning to the Greeks, turning to the Germans. And it is also then, as he continues to explain, how logic and the human mind individually works. And socially works thus as all of us individuals and each of us being a brick in the wall, a Greek in the Germans, I was going to say, and I am not that uncivilized. So Hegel's conception of the revolutionary relationship between master and slave influenced many, especially progressive left-leaning political thinkers such as Karl Marx, the most famous of the Hegelians, who now, if Karl Marx gets his little mittens, most Marxist, on the master-slave dialectic, what do you think he's going to do with that? Where is now, let me see. I understand, as not a Marxist person, but as someone of the world, most internationally, though not so internationalist, I would find that unpleasing types. So basically, I would say, okay, so you're telling me that there's a revolution and then necessary stages of history. You think it's German Lutheranism and capitalism, but as I am, Marx increasingly says capitalist and capital a lot. He used the word capital a lot. He doesn't actually say capitalism much. He says it apparently 3 times in Das Kapital, which is possibly the word most about capitalism ever. All 3 of them. All 3 volumes and all the thickness. That Marx, in that 3-volume serious set, is basically saying the word capital a lot. He barely says the word capitalist, but of course we know that all as capitalism, industrialized mercantilism. Marx says, overdo that, over-revolutionize that, you then have the final reason synthesis of the scientific more humanity. Marxists love saying they are not religion, they are science, and they are overturning the old and the traditional. This is very much super Hegel, right beyond Hegel for Marx. In Sartre's circle of existentialist friends in France later, the feminist Simone de Beauvoir used it very much as a central feminist theorist, as Wollstonecraft in France before her, used it for the liberation of women in her second sex, and the post-colonialist and anti-racist Frantz Fanon, I will cover each of these along with Sartre, used it for the liberation of the colonized and enslaved in black skin white masks. I am going to actually get to Fanon, and I'm going to do a bit about us and get out. I'd like to. I want to include this, as short in the material of the stuff, because again, there is a lot on dual consciousness and Fanon that would clearly be in work of Black American art. And as some white guy, again, who doesn't wait to be reborn, in every kind of person before talking about it, smack about everybody and all the folks that we love and we're dialectical with. Yes, back and forth with all of this colonized and liberated and enslaved bunch of Europeans and otherwise. So, with all these folks unmentioned, Black Skin and White Masks is very much about the duality of dual black consciousness and going back and forth as self and other in one's mind. That would be existentialism of Sartre and self and other, and Sartre's very much very into Marx even after Stalin, and Camus is not, and thus wins the Nobel Prize and doesn't accept it. That Frantz Fanon, hanging out with the same set of these folks, writes Black Skin, White Mask, saying that black people have to be black and then try to be white. And he says that's dual consciousness. He is framing it entirely in terms of master-slave dialectic put in terms of another German dude, Freud, because Fanon is a psychoanalyst. And I will get into the roots of psychoanalysis and why I do and don't like that and why I prefer Wittgenstein. I like Fanon fine. I am going to say it isn't psychoanalysis, it's behaviorism, which I like, with Wittgenstein over Freud. But I will not talk all that and I will get to Fanon, and what I like plenty about all that, in spite of the psychoanalysis, which I tend to resist. My grandfather was a psychoanalyst. Fanon was a psychoanalyst. I know how he is using Hegel as a Frenchman. I do know of Martinique and Black Dude. I know how he is using some of these concepts. And it is the kind of thing where black intellectuals in America would be screwing with those very concepts, and especially in surreal movies like Us and Get Out. So, much happiness and love. I definitely am going to walk all of these concepts, again, out into the later thinkers we're going to cover. And again, as a somewhat lefty, anti-racist white American dude, I definitely enjoy those movies, and I love to share the basics of all these concepts. They are in our world and our lives and art. And should be. And again, there's Back to the Fourth. Change the channel, listen to a bunch of stuff all the time. But Fanon was an inspiration to Black Panthers, such as activist and professor and ally Angela Davis to the Black Panthers, who went to Germany to study Hegel before being arrested by the FBI later in America for providing shotguns to Black Panthers in Oakland during the 60s. And then she actually beat the rap in the FBI on that, which is nobody I probably expected. Often called the Big Three, class, gender, and race are the major social divisions between people. Notice actually with Marcuse, many right-wingers call it cultural Marxism. And this is very much the roots of what is derided very much by right-wing people, I would say in way too blanket, all or none ways, of course, rather dogmatically, as cultural Marxism. Being concerned with class, gender, and race in academics today would very much make one sometimes lefty, not all the time, but that would be very master-slave dialectic of Hegel put into all of these areas. You have Marx, de Beauvoir, and Fanon. That would be class, rich versus poor, gender, male versus female, and heterosexuality, homosexuality, and all of this. With the turf wars of the feminists, I do not cover, nor am an expert in at all. And race and ethnicity, the globalism, the colonialism, and the problems in the inner and the outer city and the suburbs onward. So we're going to talk about all that stuff, and as we get to later ideas in postmodernism, I do love, as a Berkeleyan and a San Franciscan, left some of my heart over there. As with all of this, I am going to get into a lot of that. And that is why we are covering some of these ideas in several videos slowly, is because it is very good for people to know their German roots of French ideas of roots of art and culture in the 60s and onward. All of these things are important to just have a loose sense of history, a loose sense of the ideas, and then see what these roots of ideas have been doing lately in French and artistic, progressive, and countercultural thinking. Because that is what people are responding to and not. The response and the counter-response and etc. all over the place. A lot of this stuff helps me constantly see these sorts of things. As one, I hope you already do see plenty in culture, like it, and of course, as say, lump it. Love it not so much, It was the 60s. So, Hegel's logic, like his phenomenology, very much passes, we can say, in the simplest of words and passings. And I am going to try to limit this video such that I'm not doing 3 whole hours on Hegel. It would take forever to get through just some of the details of each of Hegel's major works, let alone then all the details of how that connects to a bunch of his other work, and thankfully I know plenty of Hegel and am not the Hegel guy and expert, but at the same time, the overall shape of Hegel's thinking and how important this stuff is very central, as I keep mentioning, for a lot of stuff. So in his logic, what Hegel did was, he really felt like people didn't understand his phenomenology and everything he was doing, even though it was kind of a sensation and people kind of liked it at the time. We are also seeing philosophers get more famous in their very day of printing progressively here. And you don't have to wait and die and wait for the Catholic Church to get over it for 20, 30, 50 years. Is increasingly happening in Hegel's day. And then Heidegger actually is a guy whose first work caught on and he shot up suddenly in his own reputation. Above his professors even, at the time. I mean, as a understudy and person studying, as a grad student to be as such. So Hegel writes his logic to try to explain how the mind goes through stages like ye olde Egyptian Orientals to the Greeks, with subjectivity to onward subjectivity, objectivity as intersubjectivity, which he believes the Europeans now are in a position to understand as our culture now all over the world. So he says the mind basically starts with kind of naive realism, things are true, dogmas. It then goes through a period of doubt, And then it comes to a period of resolution. This stuff is way too much like so much Buddhist thought that I'm not even going to get into it. And of course it is and isn't like that, because Hegel is not really a Buddhist. But there is a lot of Trinity three-stage development and a lot of Indian and Christian and all sorts of thought. Human beings do love 3. It's the fascinating number, and it's the magic number for Schoolhouse Rock. And it is something like if there's a start and an end, then there is the truth and the meaning and the journey between and the middleman. So, with all of that middling man, Hegel says that logic starts out very much with sense certainty, like Samuel Johnson kicking the rock to disprove Berkeley. Stuff is just right as rain, right in front of us. I see this categorically, it is just is, and that's every idiot we ever think is an idiot, no matter who we are. So it's just common sense, folk psychology. Hegel does use a word very much like folk psychology, means facts are right as rain, I just see them. Think about how much that is our world. Every idiot you hate looks at some media and then thinks, oh, that's correct, and doesn't pass through stages of thought and dialectic, again, as Husselbeck says, glancing at the other position in order to declare yourself quickly the winner. So it does seem, as I love saying, the table is solid, then I think about it, I go through reverse engineering, I understand more, this table is only so solid, birch wood, etc. I have to go through motions to see it ain't just right as rain and just solid none. So it seems that truth and meaning are just self-evident, clear in itself, and unmistakable, but we go back and forth, and Hegel takes way too many motions to basically say, we understand that while we say it is now nighttime, as we sit and we examine anything like what's night, what's now, what do all these things mean, we find that we're pointing at things and that our words, it is now nighttime, have grown stale. This is very much being, non-being, becoming. And the now, which is so immediate, this is very Heraclitus. Hegel thinks Heraclitus, first major true philosopher in ancient times. Because being, non-being, becoming is very much Hegel's triad. Our now, which is so immediate, changes with time, so any statement about the here and now is not universal, but just particularly this or that. As then philosophy and the human mind tries to understand naive realism, there's just facts, right here, these scientific theories, that gets confusing. Why aren't there just laws with Newton? Why is there theories with Einstein now? Well, as the mind tries to make sense of the positive and the negative, it goes through several stages of politics, the French Revolution, and that's Hegel now trying to flesh out the psychology behind what he has already fleshed out in his Phenomenology, which is his history of everything, but more specifically history of philosophy, Greeks, Germans himself. So he argues the mind turns from sense certainty, which is part of truth but incomplete, to the relation of subject and object. And it looks at the subjective versus the objective. This is very Locke and very Hume wrestling with this stuff. The mind looks for the answer in essences, beings that are stable and static. This is also Kant's glasses, and a dead forms rather than living forms, with Hegel, and then I will argue Wittgenstein. In the second stage of the Greeks, Hegel says it's Plato's idealist response to Heraclitus's never-ending flux, static metaphysics in response to the changing world. Which, please watch my videos about that. I won't go into this, but at the time I mention Hegel a lot because I am telling people, and you know how a lot of this Heraclitus and Plato enter into, as Heraclitus is just starting to be a thing read by some Germans, and is finalized in the early 1800s in form, Heraclitus and the Fragments of, is it's Hegel saying, and there's Heraclitus first, Plato last, but he and Kant are not perfect enough for me, and the final Heraclitus here, which is a movement amongst us this evening. Hegel says that this is Kant's idealistic response then to Hume. So you have the never-ending flux of Heraclitus and Hume. If you know anything about the history of philosophy so far, what we have is Hegel is saying, in ancient Greece, I can see Heraclitus, all his flux, never step in the same river twice. I then see Plato, ideal metaphysical categories and pure essence of being static, but how do we have that? Yeah, you got to wait and go to grad school with Plato, then he'll whisper it to you, perhaps. But then we have Hume, all truth and meaning is habit, prejudice, and assumption, very Heraclitus step in the river. And out of it, it's a whole different river. Then you have Kant saying, I have static glasses and categories of the blank slate of Locke. Hegel thinks he just happens to be the super Plato to come along and out Heraclitus and Plato, and then step 2, 3, it's going to Egypt, Greece, Germany. He's going to be the final tip of the pyramid over and above the middleman Kant here, who cannot get past static categories with open chess moves and moves of thought, the self-completing form of skepticism for Hegel. I do caution, though, the problem is right after all of this, with Hegel trying to come up with the final set of tools in the toolbox, the superior synthesis, the superior living form of Kant's categories as moves of mind and moves of logic that are in motion and evolving, at least, but they have sort of hit their final form. Sadly, we are going to have Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and others coming right after this who are going to say, you think it's a closed toolbox, what if it's an open jungle, and what if it continues to evolve? And it very much does. Not entirely. I do believe the human mind remains the human mind, but it very much does continue to evolve. So what do we say about that, and how much do we get closure with Hegel in the final form of Lutheranism and Republican Dad in the gated community of knowledge, dogmatism, and understanding? Well, revolution and reason continue on, like my heart, which will go on. Yes, won't sing you the refrain yet again. So, self is in world, the world is part of the self and the whole situation. And for Hegel, oddly enough, like I get with a bit of Heraclitus and a bit of the Locke and the Hume, necessity and freedom are for Hegel one and the same thing. I did this with Spinoza a bit. Specifically, Hegel thinks Spinoza's a prince. He also thinks that necessity and freedom don't just be a determinist, because actually chaos and determination, the skeptics of Greece say life is fair and unfair. Law and chaos, for Hegel, man, woot, are one and the same thing. Law and determination are chaos and openness. Openness and chaos are determination and order. And all that, effectively for Hegel, is as much as you and I glimpse and watch the mind of God. Hopefully our eyes are watching God. So, because all of this, yeesh, continues to move onward ever unceasingly. So, what you find is that Hegel's like, no, we just now have philosophy, science, and art. That's going to continue to be philosophy, science, and art. It's kind of Fukuyama. We're in the final age of history. It's just going to be capitalism. Okay, so that's just going to continue onward, be good and bad, and what else are you going to do? I mean, come on. So it's very much Fukuyama heading off Marx. No, we're just going to have this back and forth. No other resolution to new stage. That's pretty much it. Fukuyama is an American, Japanese-American economist and thinker. So Hegel thinks Kant was a great thinker, but his inability to tolerate contradiction made Kant a dead corpse and a set of glasses and hardly living being with a moving revolutionary mind entirely. Living authentic thinking must be ready and willing to contradict any part of itself, breathing the life of opposition into any stale conception. Now, I am going to cover here finally, just for a moment, Alejandro Kojev, and I believe I'm saying that name as best as I can. It's not Kojivi. It gives me the heebie-kojivis. Kojev, I believe is how it is pronounced, was a Russian-born philosopher living in Paris, and he introduced many French thinkers, famously, to Hegel's work through his seminars, informal meetings at people's houses between 33 and 39, which is actually as the Nazis are rising in Germany, and then Paris was seized, I believe in 39, by the Nazis, which put somewhat an end to the Russian seminars and such. Kojev is actually thought by some to have been somewhat of a Russian agent, and actually it'd be a good time to get the heck out of Paris. His seminars were attended by the philosophers Sartre and Merleau-Ponty, if you want to get super QAnon conspiracy-wise. And the surreal writers Bataille, and we're going to get to him, and Breton a little less, the Pope of Surrealism, who excommunicates you if he doesn't find you revolutionary enough and too traditional. And the psychoanalyst Lacan, the French Freud. Freud believes in objective truth. Lacan's like, that's so over, man. I'm so super Hegel. What Freud was truly saying, even though Freud clearly says there's objective and subjective truth and science ain't oceanic infantile religion. Lacan's like, no, subjectivity is objectivity, very Hegel. That is what Freud meant all along. I am more Freud than Freud. I am a Frenchman. So Zizek then says we have to out Hegel in his less than nothing and all of the ness. So again, Eliot and otherwise, Kojev is one of the people to introduce French and Heideggerian folks to a Heideggerian Hegel. We have not yet had Nietzsche and Heidegger, so I cannot yet introduce you to a Heideggerian Hegel. But I will mention as we get to Nietzsche, we're going to go Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Heidegger, French time. This is the beginning of, with Nietzsche to Heidegger and Bataille, German time becoming French land. Again, a little bit at 1939, all too much. I oftentimes like to joke, much love and the horrors of the world. World War I and World War II are going to be formative for all of this, in case you hadn't noticed, between 33, 39, and otherwise. And again, as I summoned, it's like 23andMe showed me, I'm like, oh wow, I'm all kinds of something. And then on my father's side, 23andMe was like, you're very purple right here, German, and it was like, okay, I guess my father's side didn't seem to wander over the Maginot Line, or past it, or before it existed, or whatever have you, and make terrible jokes, which I won't. But, it's again, my German side of the family didn't seem to mix it up with the Frenchies much happiness and love, and that would be very French, We're getting rather touchy-feely about all of this. So, that said, later, major French thinkers who weren't at those meetings, but Foucault, Derrida, Baudrillard, all these very hip French postmodernists are super Heideggerian, Hegelian, German, French, Franco thinkers. And so, not so Franco. Again, that's more Spain, I say. So, with all of this, and I say onward, Kojève read Hegel through the lens of Marx and Heidegger, and he focused, now he's possibly the Soviet agent, not sure, and he focused on the phenomenology, particularly the master-slave dialectic, and tying it to Napoleon. Now, why would he do all of that, and why would that be a whole lot of my talk? It is not just that I'm trying to out-French the French and out-lefty the lefties. That's not actually what I'm doing. I am explaining to you the history of human thought and how it's affected people. And again, like it or lump it, that's how a lot of German thought got to a lot of French. And the French got very left-wing, which with what could be seen as, decently enough, lefty and progressive, but decently right-wing plenty in Hegel's life and Heidegger yeesh thinking. And then they got into Hegel a la Heidegger-ese via Kojève and others. So as a final note here, we can end the talk before the hour plenty. A friend of mine actually found and passed me a Huffington Post comedy piece. At first I did, and this has happened, the Huffington Post likes to write articles. I have mistakenly referred to this as The Onion before, I realized. The Huffington Post occasionally likes to post comedy pieces, and of course you read it, and this is one of those things online, you start reading, you're like, oh my god, no. I recently started, and then you're like, oh, this is humor, I was just a sucker, this is not, and then you look, oh, it's in the humor section, as people fall for Onion articles all the time, of course, that are political, and don't read, of course, everything, and I'm guilty of that, of course. He passed me a piece, and at first, as I started reading it, and I didn't really see his, what he was saying on it, I was like, oh my god, this is hilarious, and then I was like, this is just, oh yeah, this is The Onion, but Huffington Post style. Ted Cruz has recently been in the news for taking a plane flight or two, back and forth, as it were, across borders and boundaries and dogmatisms and political practices. So, regardless of all that, without mentioning anything else, but remembering the Tea Party led to a bunch of the stuff and the Trump and the things right now, without getting political, but we've been political the whole time with Hegel, of course, the Huffington Post somewhat roasted the Tea Partying Republicans and used what I found to be very sophisticated jokes that make total sense once you've had these Hegel talks, but before that, most people would stare at these jokes and not get it. In fact, you could try to look it up and it actually still wouldn't make much sense. But we have now, if you listen to these talks on Hegel, actually have enough here to understand this Huffington Post piece rather well, and I always have to joke, philosophy majors clearly out there having many different careers, and writing jokes for others, let's hope. And them's good practice and humanity according to Hume, and the active philosopher here, whomever wrote this piece. I have to say, knew some Hegel, and I wrote, again, my master's thesis on Hegel, so I laughed out loud when my friend, threw me this. But yes, so back in the Obama days, children, for your time, is that Chuck Hagel was a Republican, and Obama nominated him as defense secretary, but the Republicans were basically putting up a show of fighting absolutely everything and being appalled by absolutely everything ever done. And so the Democrats did wondered in the Huffington Post and other more Democrat-aligned left-leaning pieces about why Chuck Hagel, and his name is actually H-A-G-E-L, but he is clearly of the same family, and has spelled the name like Hume, spelled it home, but then changes it to Hume so that people don't mispronounce the Scot. Hegel, the German, is very clearly, Chuck Hagel is of the Hegel clan of the Germans. Clan is Scots, though, the Scottish clans, etc. Yeesh. And so it's not H-E-G-E-L, it's Chuck Hagel, H-A-G-E-L, but it's very much the Hegels and the Germans. He is from, I believe, like my Gerlach family, from the East Coast and a bit of the Southeast Coast. As the Germans are coming over in all sorts of ages, etc. And so when they blocked the Republican guy from being the defense secretary, they were like, we don't oppose any of this sort of Marxist German kind of stuff that Obama's doing. And so the Huffington Post decided to step in and mock that they were opposing Hegel because he's all too German. And we're going to get to how humanity's all too human with Nietzsche. So he's also German and scary to Americans. So Senator, and I'll just read the whole quote here out loud, which again, I think is funny. Nobody would find this funny until after you either write a master's thesis on Hegel or have heard my talks just now, which I've aimed specifically at this being the dessert and the final mint on the pillow. Quote, is Senator Ted Cruz launched a blistering attack on Defense Secretary nominee Hegel, asserting a direct link to Karl Marx. Quote, history shows that Marx not only read Hegel, but took his inspiration from him, as if Karl Marx, founder of communism, studied Chuck Hegel, the Republican, and learned from him rather than Hegel, said the Princeton-educated Harvard Law School graduate. Quote, I should know, I was taught by at least 12 communist professors at Harvard, end quote. That's obviously roasting him for the fact that academics do talk about Marx a lot. That hardly makes the law department at Harvard full of Marxists. I have to, as my Berkeleyan head, shake it a tiny bit, back and forth most dialectically and progressively, and say, yeah, I keep shaking my head is what I mean, progressively. It keeps continuing rather conservatively and dogmatically. Is that, you understand, we all understand. Let's not re-reason this. Basically, it's like, yeah, all your professors at and then, of course, his law professors at Harvard were like, no, we weren't all communists. Thanks for throwing us all under the bus. Broadening his attack on Hegel, and citing French, exclamation point in brackets, not triple though, socialist professor Alejandro Kojève's interpretation of Hegel's thesis. Now, why is Ted Cruz going to cite Kojève's interpretation of Hegel's thesis? But that's what we were just talking about in this video. The master-slave dialectic as Hegel's thesis and idea. Cruz warned of the, quote, danger to America of having a Secretary of Defense who believes that history ended with the Battle of Jena, end quote. Napoleon. This person who wrote this bit knows who Kojève is, knows that Kojève centers Hegel's first pages of, who's going to read a lot more Hegel than the first pages, of master-slave dialectic is Napoleon, you Frenchies. You know who that guy is. French people have heard of Napoleon before. I'm pretty sure. Gonna have to look that up. But he's like, why this French, French socialist, he calls Kojève a French socialist, actually, not a Russian agent. And he says this French socialist clearly believes, along with Hegel, how the heck do we have somebody so stupid as to think history ended with the Battle of Jena? That is, as Hegel is writing his Phenomenology of Spirit, the Battle of Jena is raging. He can hear it. He says in the intro, I can hear it. That's Napoleon coming. Hate to say it. That's history, folks. He doesn't really say, come on in. But he effectively almost is like, but this is what history is going to be. We need to have something like the establishment of something like this because that is going to be the coming of the age. Funny enough, I'm pretty sure Chuck Hegel as a possible defense secretary and Republican senator, I would have to look back up all of this, probably as a sitting politician doesn't believe that history ended as Hegel does at the Battle of Jena, which is me always saying, the final form of culture is German Lutheranism. That's right, for Hegel. Battle of Jena. We're done now. Napoleon. Former Governor Sarah Palin, miss all of her, revealed that after she took a speed reading course, she had read Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit in 20 minutes and concluded, it's all in German, end quote. And that's the end of the bit. Much love and happiness, It's again, if you watch the space Nazi Swedish movies, they have Sarah Palin being the pro-Trump, they have her basically being Trump, launching the anti-moon Nazi, forces, etc. Well, for the Swedes, it's other words, Swede deal. Palin didn't turn out to be the Trump, did she? Trumped that. Yep, nailed it, again, with the theses. So, much happiness with theses and other related words. Happiness, much sunshine, not too much politics, though always yeesh, and I will, again, see you, hopefully not talk to you, or dialectically commune with you too ever so much with these jokes. I will see you, if I ever see you.